and I'm the president and the CEO of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. We are a public policy research institution, but more than that, we have an educational mission. We're seeking to try to place this relationship between the United States and particular friends, allies, and strategic partners on as firm a foundation as possible. Firmer than it has been, and firmer than it is, firmer than it is likely to be, unless enough good people on all sides and all points of the compass in the relationship have this as a common goal, an objective, and work hard and diligently and persistently to make this occur. It's a long game, but no country on the map has been longer in the game of nations than Iraq. In 2003, it's not an overstatement, though some may find it harsh or controversial, to say that America was involved in actions that, in the minds of many, killed a country. Killed a country that has given much to itself, to the region, to the globe. This is where, for those who are not specialists in the region, are indebted to the alphabet, to legal systems, to urban city town management, to the just and fair distribution and effective distribution of water, the alphabet, the museum, the artifacts. It's not lost on the Iraqi people and the world as well that when the American forces entered Iraq, a country that had not invaded the United States, had not attacked the United States, and represented no imminent threat to the United States, that the armed forces marched right straight past the country's priceless National Museum with its treasures and went straight to the Ministry of Petroleum. Think of how that looks, sounds, resonates to the people of the country that we're focusing on today. We couldn't ask for a more qualified, experienced, educated, and intensely focused individual on these issues in his country than the Iraqi ambassador today. We have with us to serve as the moderator and to guide us through the discussion and the questions, Colonel retired Abbas Dahouk, who is a full-fledged member of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, Board of Directors. Colonel Dahouk served and lived, worked in Iraq. He served as the defense attaché for the Department of Defense in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, and then subsequently in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs in the U.S. Department of State. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no ordinary country. This is not a peripheral part of this. It's not a distant nation. This is not a country that should be dismissed, overlooked, that Americans are unaware of and unappreciative of. We have what we call in front of us a cerebral massage, thanks to the ambassador who posted his credentials to the United States several years ago. And this is a sequence of previous sessions that we've had for the American people in pursuit of the National Council's educational mission. This is a follow-up. This is a further on. This is a deepening. This is a heightening. This is a broadening of efforts to increase our information, our insight, our knowledge, our understanding, our analysis, and our ability to better understand a country and the people to which all of humanity is indebted. Mr. Ambassador and Abbas Dahouk, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for your remarks and for the kind introduction. And I welcome all listeners out there to examine the dynamics in Iraq, the good and the bad, with our His Excellency, the Ambassador, Dr. Fareed Yasseen. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador. As we discussed, as Dr. Anthony mentioned, Iraq continues to be a country of vital interest to the United States. The United States continue to invest blood and treasure in the country. At the same time, you have also two neighboring countries, Turkey and Iran, continues also to invest after their interests. And the country itself also has numerous domestic challenges, ethnic challenges, sectarian challenges, economic challenges. But there's a lot of good stories remain also in Iraq. So before, Mr. Ambassador, before we start asking some questions before we start our discussion, I will give you the floor to give us a snapshot about the current dynamics that's happening in Iraq today. The floor is yours.
Colonel Daouk, Dr. Anthony, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for your very, very kind words. I can't start this intervention without referring to my last discussion with you folks on the 26th of February 2020. Seemed like a totally different world. We were dealing in person. I was a little apprehensive a bit because people had started talking about the pandemic, but I think very few people had imagined that it would disrupt the world in the way it did. And in a way, it really united the world because no country is immune, and we're all in this together. But fortunately, we'll soon be out of this, and maybe sooner than waiting for a full year, we'll be able to reunite in person and talk and discuss. So we're in the month of March. March is a really special month for Iraq. It's a month of souvenirs and occasions. And I'll start off, if you'll allow me, by addressing all of those amongst my countrymen and beyond who celebrate Nowruz, which is a celebration of the rebirth of the world through spring. This is something that has been celebrated in Iraq from time immemorial. It's been a national holiday for a long time, and it sort of is in line with the end of winter, beginning of spring, particularly in the Kurdish and the Kurdistan regional government area, of where nature is really striking. So it's an occasion to rejoice. But Iraq being Iraq, the month of March also sees us remembering terrible things that happened. On the 16th of March in 1988, we witnessed one of the world's worst tragedies that took place in Iraq under the Ba'ath, which was the gassing of the town of Halabja, where something like 5,000 people were gassed, most of them women and children, in the most horrible way. The survivors actually are still suffering from the after effects of what they were subjected to, still suffering. Of course, we have to also remember the fact that the war of 2003 started on the 19th of March, led to the fall of Baghdad on the 9th of April. And here, for most Iraqis, I think, me also, it's a mixed bag. It was certainly a liberation because it got us rid of the person who was responsible for the horrors that I just mentioned. But it also opened up Pandora's box of things that had lain dormant and that actually were amplified by the actions of people who came in from the outside, funded by, people who didn't want Iraq to thrive. So we saw the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which was eventually defeated through the surge. Then the departure of American troops, then the resurgence of Al-Qaeda in the form of ISIS. And I have to tell you that, my lowest point as an Iraqi diplomat happened on the 10th of June 2014, when Mosul fell to ISIS. and shortly thereafter, and actually I buy copies of this to give to people to show how wrong they were. Time magazine ran an issue where the cover had the contours of a map of Iraq that was burning, and the caption read, "The end of Iraq." Well, we're still here, and I think we'll still be here once, I don't know. I think we'll outlive all those that have pronounced us dead. But it's a slog. It's not easy. We still have remnants of Al Qaeda fighting from hidden quarters in sparsely populated areas and from sleeper cells. We have to face a terrible, difficult financial situation with the drop of oil prices. We have to also, like I mentioned earlier, confront the scourge of the pandemic. But nonetheless, we're still hopeful. On top of that, over 2019, 2020, we had a protest movement that led to the fall of the government and the selection of a new government that has as its main task to start to carry out new elections. They're scheduled for the month of October, and I have to tell you, and I say this with some satisfaction because it shows that this is something that the government is really paying attention to. Our instructions as diplomats working in democratic countries is to solicit as much help as possible from our friends and partners and allies, so that we can make sure that the elections are carried out in full force under transparent conditions, so that the Iraqi population can participate fully, and so our democratic process can proceed. And I mean, for all those that want to point the finger at what happened in 2003, may I remind you that we've had 5 or 6 changes of government that happened very peacefully, very without loss of life. I would not have said this had I not witnessed what happened on the 6th of January in Washington, D.C., something I never thought I'd imagine seeing. But it's just to tell you that this is not an easy thing to achieve, and also not an easy thing to maintain. And we're trying to do our best to maintain it. This month of March has been actually quite remarkable in that a historic event took place that, in fact, can be seen as a restart button. Was a good feel moment. I'm referring to the visit of His Holiness Pope Francis to Iraq. It was remarkable in many, many ways. And to me, it sort of contained 3 messages. One was that the message of His Holiness Pope Francis was one has to stay the course. He was ill. He had been vaccinated, of course. But the pandemic was taking place in Iraq. Just before, in fact, his arrival, his representative in Iraq contracted the coronavirus and fell down to COVID. I think he's recovering, thank God. Then, of course, the security threats. And please note that just a few weeks ago, rockets were launched at Erbil, where the Pope, conducted a massive service in a difficult to defend and protect stadium. So that was a great message of hope. Stay the course, staying the course. The second message was a message of healing and support to Iraq's minorities and especially its Christian communities. And I think it can best be exemplified by the fact that he conducted a service in Mosul in a square surrounded by churches that had been destroyed by ISIS. He also conducted a service in Baghdad at a church that had been attacked by Al Qaeda in 2010, where I think they caused the death of 44 worshippers and 14 Iraqi service members. So it's a message of support and of hope and of healing. Not an easy thing to, that's not something we should overlook. And the third message is a message of outreach and brotherhood, exemplified by his two events that he conducted in the south of Iraq. He met with Ayatollah Sistani, who to most Iraqis is the most important voice in Iraq and beyond, a voice of reason, a voice of caution, somebody who actually saved Iraq with his fatwa in 2014 to all and sundry to rise and defend Iraq and push back ISIS. And then he conducted a service or a ceremony, an event in Nasiriyah, and the birthplace of Abraham. Abraham is undoubtedly an Iraqi because I heard this said once on French television by a rabbi, Rabbi Josie Eisenberg, in a discussion with Elie Wiesel, that Abraham was the first political refugee in the world. And I heard that and I said, well, of course, that's why he's Iraqi, you know. So, but anyway, my point, it was a message of outreach and of brotherhood and of universal brotherhood that I think we will try to implement in Iraq as much as we can. I have to tell you that throughout his trip, hand on heart, I was really worried because this is not the first time. We expect a lot from a visiting South American. I will remind you that in 2003, Sergio Vieira de Mello went as the envoy of the United Nations. He arrived in Iraq in June. I met him there, and he worked to transform what had been an occupation into an internationally sanctioned process under the guidance of the Security Council to transform a dictatorship into a democracy. And he was killed on the 19th of August 2003. And as he was dying, bleeding to death, his message to the people who were speaking to him was, stay the course, the mission has to continue, help Iraq. And I do get emotional whenever I think of this, but it is the same message that His Holiness Pope Francis conveyed with his trip to Iraq, a message that is fully received and acknowledged by the Iraqi government, that makes it its plan of action. We are forging ahead with our elections. And not only there, I think this government has undertaken something that's quite remarkable, which is an attempt to restructure Iraq's economy and revive its private sector, taking very bold measures as it does that. One of them was a recent devaluation of the dinar. Not a popular thing to do. I mean, we all suffered from it, but it's for the good of the country and it's necessary. And hopefully, it'll be a launching pad to much better to come. As to our relationships with the United States and the general environment we live in, well, we do live in a neighborhood that is not very, very easy. The thing that I actually, most other Iraqi officials complain about is that many countries look at Iraq not through a lens focused on Iraq. If you look at you recently mentioned, Dr. Anthony mentioned the Game of Nations. Miles Copeland wrote a book about this, where he discusses the fact that the United States did not see the coming coup of 1958 because they were caught up in this East-West conflict. So Iraq was looked at through the East-West conflict for a very, very long time. Now, especially under the previous administration, we were looked at, we felt very much so with an impact from the United States relationship to Iran. We would like our partners, our allies to look at us for us. I think Iraq is a country that has offered a lot to the world. It can offer a lot more. And we look at some sort of normalization. In fact, we are in the process of doing this. I can tell you, for example, that my last communications with senior officials in the United States didn't have to do with military stuff, or it had to do with the sale of rice. So hopefully we'll recover our traditional relationships that prevailed in the 30s and 40s and 50s, where the largest medium of exchange between the United States and Iraq occurred through culture through trade, through technology. And I am pretty confident that we'll get there. And we have a vehicle to do that. We have, as you know, signed a strategic framework agreement of friendship and cooperation, and these words are very important. We've had recently a round that took place last August, and we're working, in fact, to relaunch it and hold the round this coming month. So I'm looking forward to that. That's part of my job. And, you know, answering the questions of your audience and the American public is also part of my job. So I want to thank you for making me do it in an easy and a pleasant way. And I'll hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Indeed, the Pope's visit was unprecedented. I think also the message of urging the Iraqi Christians to stay in Iraq and be a vital element. They are a vital element. Be a good part of rebuilding Iraq. I think that's a good message. But I want to just also take you back to this East-West games of nation. You are still in the crossfires between United States and Iran. I mean, United States, as you know, they're already they have boots on the ground. They do have missions to do standard security cooperation with like any other countries in the region and in the world. They do have another mission as well to, like you mentioned, also ISIS in your statement. They still have a mission to conduct counter-ISIS campaign. They also have a third mission, is to protect themselves, because you know the current Iraqi security forces element unable to protect the U.S., unable to protect the international community. So also the United States have their own. They support the Peshmergas, another militia forces or forces outside the control of the Iraqi central government. At the same time, you have over estimates says that 200,000 militias, the Popular Mobilization Forces. Some people call it Shiite militias. I don't like to call them Shiite militias, but nevertheless militias that are operating somewhat outside the control of the central government, heavily influenced by Iran. So again, you're in this, remain in the crossfires between a friend that you want your friend, the United States, and some European countries. You have about 500 NATO forces still operating in Iraq. So those friends want to help you move forward. At least they're looking after their interests, but they want to help you. And they have also a neighbor thinks they're after themselves. So how do you navigate this? How do you navigate between the friend and the neighbor in this next 2-3 years? I mean, you survived the Trump administrations where there was maximum pressure. This may be more of on the political side. But how do you contribute yourself? How do you shape that fights of nations or this crossfire between the United States and Iran? In your own words.
Next question. No, look, this is one of the difficulties. I always say that the problems that Iraq faces are problems that are cumulative and that are inherited. The current situation with the presence of armed groups in Iraq has resulted from the fact that in 2014, people had to stand up armed groups to fight ISIS, and thank God they did, because honestly, without the PMF, I do not know how we could have, controlled the country and allowed the Iraqi armed forces to defeat ISIS. Wasn't an easy thing to do. And so we're in a situation where we have to confront and transition through post-conflict situation. We're not the first country to have done this. It's never an easy thing to do, even when you don't have regional difficulties or regional political tensions. I mean, look at Latin America. It took them decades, years and decades to resolve some of these issues and to complete their so-called DDR programs. This is what we actually need, and one of the things that I'm really proud of is I actually managed to get the Prime Minister of Iraq at the time to meet with the Colombian president, because that country also offers us some examples of how to navigate this. and it'll have to be a combination of, economics, of institutional arrangements, um, um, fashioned and customized to the specific needs of Iraq. So, for example, now we have many people who fall under the umbrella of the popular mobilizations. Let me set this straight. They are part of the Iraqi structure. They, in fact, are paid for by the Iraqi budget, as are, by the way, the Peshmerga. And the Iraqi budget comes essentially, from the province of Basra, which is our biggest oil producer. But right now, the popular mobilizations, in fact, includes a number of groups, some that are more standard, if you will, than others. And there is a continuous effort to try to integrate them into the armed forces of Iraq, into the regular structures, and at the same time see whether their resources can be used to jumpstart our economy through the creation of other jobs. Bear in mind that the government is Iraq's #1 employer, and a lot of people, join the military because they don't have any other means to feed their families. The one problem that you haven't mentioned, which in fact is sometimes affects the presence of these armed groups, is the problem of corruption. And that's another thing that the government is really intent on fighting. And in fact, we have been tasked to look at how to garner as much international support as we can to resolve this issue, and to, if we can do that, it would be great to recapture and recover stolen Iraqi assets.
Okay, thank you. That was,
but one more thing, guys. With regard to the regional tensions, may I remind you that between 2014 and 2018, when both members of the PMF, whatever their allegiances, if you will, and the United States military were sometimes in close proximity to each other, not a single incident happened. I think it's because there were, some tacit agreements that, allowed for a modus vivendi that led to, a peaceful coexistence that allowed Iraq to start, rebuilding. And I hope that at some point we will recover that state of being. As to the presence of foreign troops, not only American troops, I mean, we acknowledge. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. Honestly, I think we would have been able to defeat ISIS on our own, but it would have cost us much, much more, and it would have taken a lot longer. And so we're very grateful to the effort and the support that we received from the coalition, and especially the United States. But I'd like to point out that right now we have arrangements that, in fact, can't be described as an occupation. No matter what people say. In 2007, for example, the total number of American troops in Iraq was around 120,000, 130,000, thereabouts. That year, I think the United States suffered 900 killed in action. The Defense Department was spending about $300 million a day. And on top of that, I very often, they'd liberate a village, and as soon as they'd leave, the insurgents would come back. And if you fast forward to, say, 2017, the total number of American troops in the region, so Syria, Iraq combined, was under 5,000. I think the expenditures of the Defense Department was under 10 million a day. And you had some 20 casualties, all in all, sad as it was, but most of them were due to accidents. And on top of all that, not a single square kilometer that was liberated from ISIS was recovered by ISIS, because on the ground, it was the Iraqis who were doing the fighting and the dying. And so as we look forward, at some point, the Iraqi, the foreign troops of the coalition, the United States, their role right now, as you pointed out, is to provide us with training and to help us in the fight against ISIS, essentially through the provision of ISR. They don't have, I think, any combat duties. At some point, we'll acquire these capabilities, and we'll reach a point where the only American troops in Iraq will be the Marines who are guarding the American embassy. And I hope and I expect that their duties will be all protocol based.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just allow me to just to follow up quickly on this foreign presence in Iraq. Now, there's the Secretary General from NATO this month announced, remember, increasing their footprint from 500 to about, I think, 4,000 troops to do the same thing, and not counter ISIS campaign, to do the train and equip of the Iraqi armed forces. Now, some people think that this will ease this tension between the PMF and the American presence. So this will decrease American presence, and perhaps that kind of calms the water down and allow those NATO forces to further train and equip the Iraqi forces, and this by this will allow the Iraqi forces to regain control of the security situation in Iraq. Do you think that that surge of European forces might calm the water on the ground between militias and foreign forces, or it's going to be the same thing? Foreign forces are foreign forces, Americans or NATO. They'll be the target for these PMF elements.
I think NATO is seen as some sort of international organization, and their role throughout has not been combat. And NATO is not, associated with any of the previous wars that we've had in Iraq. So I think, in terms of political packaging, I think it might be an easier thing to present, especially that the duties of these forces will be to train and equip. Mind you, the United States is doing much of that as well, but they're also participating more fully in the fight against ISIS. For the time being, nobody will tell you that we do not need their support and their services. We do.
Thank you. That was informative. I'm gonna jump. You mentioned about jump-starting the economy in Iraq, and I know there's another economic cooperation or economic interest or for the United States to boost the economic cooperation between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Even under the Obama administration, there was a lot of push to reopen the Arar crossing between you and Saudi Arabia. And eventually now the crossing is open. It was closed for almost 30 years. And this is wide open, and that's a big venue where we can see a lot of economic opportunities in terms of oil-related, agriculture-related, construction-related, and besides also open up the a land route for Hajj in Saudi Arabia. How do you see this under this current administration? You have Mr. McGurk is actually back in the scene, and that was one of his one of his files back then. So do you think there will be another boost in this bilateral relationship between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, not only on the economic side, also perhaps start doing some military-to-military relations as well? How do you see that going forward?
Well, to me, I think this is a little bit back to the future. I mean, ultimately, maybe we'll reach an arrangement where we will recover, the relationships that we had, at the time of the Baghdad Pact, where our relationships with Iran, with all our neighboring countries, in fact, were ideal, and cooperation was ongoing, and in fact, we were on the verge of merging with Jordan. There are tons of reasons to promote all the things that you mentioned. We haven't talked about this, but one of the things that I'm trying to promote to my authorities, maybe because of my own personal professional background, but I think the real threat to the region is climate change. And whatever we can do to use our energy and satisfy our energy needs in an intelligent way, in a way that manages resources well, that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, will be beneficial. And so one of the things that we are trying to do, and the Trump administration has been very helpful in that also, is to connect the Iraqi electrical grid to Saudi Arabia. I mean, ideally to me is that this would extend to linkages to Turkey. Mind you, recall that because of the geography of the region, the peak demand for electricity in Saudi Arabia happens during the summer. The peak demand for electricity in Turkey happens during the winter, and so it would make sense to put this in the same bag and connect us all in the same grid. And the other thing that we're working on really hard, that's one thing that we unfortunately are paying the price for because of our recent history, is that we're trying to eliminate gas flaring. I think we flare the equivalent of about $2 billion worth of gas every year, and that's a waste of money, waste of resources, environmentally sinful, no other word. And so all of these things are all geared towards the right direction of integrating Iraq back into its environment, in which we do not want to be part of any axis against any other. We want to be a uniter, not a divider.
Thank you. What about let's see, also on regional question here. We talked about Saudi Arabia. What about you mentioned Jordan, you mentioned Turkey, we talked about Iran. What about the other neighbor, Kuwait? How do you see your relationship?
Relationships are great.
With Kuwait?
The relationships are great with Kuwait. I have to say this because, the dean of the Arab Diplomatic Corps, somebody I love dearly, and that's Sheikh Salman Sabah. But honestly, our relationships are very, very good.
Okay. Let's go back to the domestic issues in Iraq. You mentioned the elections coming up in October. Currently, there's budget fights. We very much know about budget fights in the United States. Sometimes we go years without budgets. We go on a congressional resolutions. But there is the budget issue is also political in Iraq, and we read a lot about the budgets on the oil between the Kurdish area and the central government, on the price of the dollar, on employment. Also, electricity is a part of that, part of this fight. So recently there was an agreement on a budget, then they got backed off on it. So talk to us a little bit about those, from insider. Tell us a little bit more about what is actually happening. Will they reach something soon and move on with it or not?
Well, I'm not so much as insider. I'm part of the administration, if you will. This is an issue that has been being discussed by parliamentarians, and for the budget. And I'm actually one of those who's as eager as any other Iraqi official to see it resolved, because we're working on a continuing resolution where we're spending, I think, 1/18 of the expenditure of the equivalent month of last year, and it's very constraining. There are a lot of things that we'd like to do that we can't. Look, this is a complex issue that has also history. What I can tell you, though, is that there is a high-powered delegation in Baghdad representing the KRG to discuss this. To me, the only way out of this is through increased transparency. We, in fact, were the first country OPEC member to become members of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative that tries to reconcile the accounting of the federal government's oil budget as well as that of the KRG. I think things like that are needed, but I'm pretty confident that I think within a couple of weeks the issue of the budget is going to be resolved.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you
I
know,
hope, yeah.
Harold, I hope, Dr. Anthony, if we could open it up to some questions. I see a long list of people who would like to put questions to His Excellency. It's your call as to the order in which you wish to proceed in that regard.
Roger. I'm actually looking through it right now, Dr. Anthony. I have a question here on the new for you on the new administration and looking back at your experience with the old administration. So what do you wish for under the new administration if you were to advise the president or the secretary of state, and also from the Trump administration that you think they need to know from Iraqi perspective to them, so not to be repeated again, or perhaps put it on the table to discuss it, so it don't have to be repeated.
Well, you know, so I've been asked this question before, and I always said that, you know, in the end, reality prevails. So all of the administrations that we've dealt with, you know, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, started out with policies that they had to correct in order to take into account the realities of the situation. For example, the Bush administration had to launch the surge, and credit goes to President Bush because he did that against the advice of all his advisors, and it worked. And we're grateful for that. With regard to the Obama administration, you recall, I mean, all American troops left Iraq in 2011, and then all of a sudden ISIS comes in. And so contrary to you know, his stated political objectives, President Obama, you know, after, I remember the speech that he gave after the killing of, you know, Foley and others, horrible events, that he couldn't let this stand, and American troops went back to support us in the fight against ISIS, also in Syria. And so, in a sense, reality prevailed, and they took corrective action. With the Trump administration, if you recall, the first decision that they took that affected us was the travel ban, and it was a decision that impacted Iraq while we were at the same time allies with the United States fighting against ISIS. And so we had you know, trainers coming back and forth, officers, soldiers, you know, technicians going to Iraq to fix things. So it was really not something you know, that satisfied reality. And so eventually the decision was rescinded. You know, what I'll always say to people is that look at reality and make your policies conform to this reality. In our case, I think in our desires, for example, we've always wanted to have a reduction of tensions in the area. This is one of the reasons why already in 2012, for example, we were promoters of the JCPOA, or something equivalent. In fact, one of the rounds that led to the discussions that led to the JCPOA took place in Baghdad. And I remember I was serving in France at the time, and some officials there actually were quite dismissive of what we could contribute to the issue. But in fact, after the fact, they were quite impressed because the Iraqi team that received them was headed by not only Hoshar Zebari, who's one of the best negotiators I know of, but also Hussein Shahristani, who was a nuclear scientist who was imprisoned by Saddam because he didn't want to work on Saddam's nuclear projects, and spent 11 years in Abu Ghraib. Pay attention to reality, and trust us. And it's not going to be a difficult thing, I think, this time around, because most of those players are people we know. I've known, you know, Brett McGurk, he's a really smart guy since 2005 or 6. Tony Blinken I met in 2009, I think. You know, the only two senior officials that I don't know of, I haven't met, are Jake Sullivan and General Odierno, because when General Odierno went to Iraq, I was actually serving in France. So, but I look forward to making their acquaintance at the appropriate juncture. So I'm hopeful. You know, the people in the administration know Iraq very, very well. I mean, the thing that I will mention is that, by and large, I think the focus of the United States currently is, and as it should be, is entirely domestic, and also responding to some sort of shifts in the general, geopolitical structure of the world, with a focus on other parts and on other emerging powers. And as a result, we're I don't want to say that we're taking the back seat. We're still important, I think, at least for the next 20, 30 years. But
Okay, thank you. That was insightful. Dr. Anthony has a question, I think.
Yes.
But go ahead, Dr. Anthony.
Mr. Ambassador, we're not that far away, long since Iraq's position and role in regional and world affairs, so certainly in the world beyond its, certainly on the intellectual front. You have us understand the educational training and leadership development dynamic and operations on the educational front between Iraq and the United States. And where does this educational priority fit on the scale of Iraqis' pressing values and interests as we go forward, especially with the new administration coming into Washington? How would you have us understand this youth component, this educational component of the Iraqi-U.S. relationship, Mr. Ambassador, please?
Well, thank you for putting your finger on a critical subject. As you know, the bulk of Iraq's population is young. We're adding a million entrants to the workforce every year, perhaps even more. And so we not only have to find a way of providing them with the skills that are requisite, but also we have to, expand the economy to provide them with the jobs that will allow them to flourish and contribute. And so far we have done a really good job of that. This is why that most Iraqis seek employment in the public sector, and this is not a sustainable solution. And this is why the Iraqi government launched a very ambitious program encapsulated in a white paper to reform Iraq's economy. And I mentioned one of the elements that this required, which was a devaluation. Throughout history, all Iraqis have been interested in education, and that's not an understatement. And many of them looked to the United States to pursue their education. Currently, there are actually 3 universities that are in fact American universities in Iraq. There's one in Sulaymaniyah, that's the oldest. There is one in Dahok, and they just started one in Baghdad. It seems very well endowed. It's promising. The irony is it's hosted in one of Saddam's old palaces. So how'd you like that? But this is something that requires funding. One of the most successful programs that the Iraqi government launched was a scholarship program launched about some 10, 12 years ago to send several thousand Iraqi students to come to the United States to acquire advanced degrees, masters and PhDs. And in fact, it was I would say too successful, because most of these students were, and it's a program that was so merit-based that the United States used it to select its Fulbright scholars. So education I think is our way out, but we need to rethink our education. Unfortunately,
How many Iraqi students, Mr. Ambassador, pardon the interruption, how many Iraqi students are currently studying in the United States?
In the few hundreds, far too few.
Yes.
Far too few.
Versus nearly a million Saudi Arabian graduates.
Over the years, yes, I know. In fact, the person who launched the educational program that I mentioned earlier had worked for a long time. His name is Dr. Zuhair Hamadi, and I think you've received him some time ago.
Yes.
And he actually was was inspired by the Saudi government's efforts to educate its population in the States. He had worked for a long time at the Saudi Cultural Office here.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Again, something with the National Council education, like Dr. Anthony, is important, and we look forward to do more on this side with Iraq, to do exchange between Iraqi students, American students, and whether the military or civilians. Another question came from the audience who talked about the reconstruction efforts. I know that the country still you have the security issues and other issues on the U.S. Iran regional challenges. What's going on in this effort? What's donor countries? Are they any breaking grounds? And just give us a little short update on that, if you will.
Far too slow, but in fact, there have been some marked successes, especially in and around Mosul with the reconstruction of landmarks that were destroyed by ISIS. There's a concerted international effort with the participation of UNESCO to rebuild the churches and the mosques that ISIS destroyed. But the truth is, what we need, is more infrastructure. If you look at the poverty numbers in Iraq, you will notice that the province of Nineveh, or the governorate of Nineveh, is near the bottom of the list precisely because of the war. But it is not at the lowest level. There are two other governorates in the south that don't do even as well. And so the demand for the reconstruction of Iraq is not only to respond to the destruction that the north of the country faced. It's also to take and to counter and fix the decades of neglect that many parts of Iraq have had to go through. I'm thinking of Diwaniyah, I'm thinking of Nasiriyah, I'm thinking of the province of Nisan. Poverty levels there are very, very high. Infrastructure is very, very inadequate. And so we have our work cut out.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I think we can have one more question or two, and I think maybe Dr. Anthony will have a question. And before I ask Dr. Anthony can ask a question, also, Mr. Ambassador, the Iraqi diaspora in the United States. Just tell us a little bit about them. Are they helping you, hinder you? How can they collaborate to help the United States and also Iraq at the same time?
So look. Thank you for raising this issue. So, in fact, there are two communities in the United States that I would really like to appeal to help in the reconstruction of Iraq. One is, as you mentioned, the Iraqi diaspora, and honestly, they haven't waited. I think 3 years ago at one of the anti-ISIS conferences, which was attended by the person, Dr. Mustafa al-Hiti, who was in charge of reconstruction, somebody came to see him representing two businessmen from Detroit. Detroit has the largest concentrations of Iraqis, especially Chaldeans, and they're very successful. I think there's an association of of Chaldean American businessmen, and their combined revenue of all the companies that are listed there, is around $10 billion with a B. So that's they can do a lot. So they came to see him because they wanted to express interest in the reconstruction of their ancestral homes, and I can only welcome that. And in fact, one of the good developments of this current government is that they brought in Dr. Sohan Najjar. She's somebody with expertise and experience in foreign investment. She now heads the Iraqi. I'm blocking on the acronym. Investment Commission, and it has connections throughout the world. And so I'm hoping that the Iraqi diaspora will respond. Had this year not been the way it was, I would have reached out to them and gone to visit. The other community that I'd like to reach out to, and here I think I'm inspired by the model of Vietnam, and maybe Colonel Dahouk can comment on this. I'll give you two examples. When the travel crisis happened, when the travel ban happened, I was in Washington with the head of the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service. We had a meeting on the Hill with Senator Corker and General Kinani, that's the general's name, and said, look, I want to see Senator McCain. Senator McCain had been very vocal on the issue of the travel ban. So we made a cold call on him, and he graciously received us. And he showed us a picture of him given to him by the Vietnamese defense minister. The picture represented him floating on a pond surrounded by Vietnamese soldiers. And he, and as well as Senator Kerry and many American servicemen who are Vietnam veterans, played a critical role in strengthening the economic ties between the United States and Vietnam. And if you look at the numbers, there's close to 1 million American servicemen who served in Iraq. These are Iraq veterans. And I would like to appeal to them to come and help us, and maybe we could replicate this model of economic success that the Vietnam veterans initiated with Vietnam.
Oh, thank you. This is actually a great topic, and if we can assist on that, also from the council on being the military to military, I think this could be a great way to bridge that gap between both countries on the education side, economic side, military side. It's actually a good venue vectors to go through it. On this, I'll pass it to to Dr. Anthony to if he has a question to ask, or we could maybe give us his final thoughts on our discussion today. Dr. Anthony.
Thank you, Colonel Dahouk, and it's great to have you as a member of our board of directors. Been looking forward to you being part of that which we seek to accomplish for a very long time. It brings a great deal of value to the table. You're not an academic, and you do not let a single day pass without dealing with ideas and ideals in institutions and looking for ways to improve the world in which we were born, raised, and lived, and inshallah will continue to live. But we've barely begun to scratch the surface of what it is that we need to know and learn about Iraq, and not just because of its people, and not just because of its country, not just because of its policies, not just because of its positions, not just because of its actions, not just because of its attitudes, all of which the ambassador has shed light on today. But we Americans have a lot of work to do. When we led this attack in 2003, little did the policy planners and implementers know what was in store for the United States and the peoples that stood with the United States and with the Iraqis who were toppling a brutal dictator whose policies towards its own people were nothing short of, in too many instances, brutal, harsh, cruel, inhumane. But if we step back and try to be clinical detached and objective. What is Iraq to us human beings? It should not be a situation where we Americans look at Iraqis and say, oh, those, oh, them, they're the other. All of us are those, them, and other to various people who are not ourselves. But this dehumanizes understanding and thinking and relations and the possibilities for improved relations between peoples of the world. Think of Iraq from another perspective. Many people look at it as oil and a gas well, not as a country. Many people look at it as a mountain of money and not as the heir and the descendants of an extraordinarily rich culture and history and civilization that has given much to world history, culture, and civilization. Think of the following for a minute. Half of a millennia, nearly 500 centuries, Iraq was the captain of the team. It was the headquarters. It was the center of what now is 2 billion human beings, between a third and a quarter of all of humanity. There's much that we stand to learn from Iraq, that we can learn from Iraq, that we must learn from Iraq. And of course, with the Easter Sunday approaching for Christians, with the New Year having just begun, as the ambassador so articulately reminded us of, and Jewish anti-Semitism charges and allegations and actions afoot, and a bias against Asians, Confucians, Jains, Hindus, Buddhists on the rise. If we look at things through the perspective and prism of Iraq, there's much that we can learn. For example, it's not just the Judeo-Christian heritage from which we have all become beneficiaries. It's the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritage, and the latter more extensively, intensively, and recently than the other two. And so we've got 2/3 of it in focus, but the other third is as important, if not more important, on various issues than the first two are aware of by many Americans. And so Baghdad was the capital of what was known as the Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasid era, from which our board member Abbas Dahouk takes his first name. We did something in 2003 that we must never forget, because the people of Iraq and the region have never forgotten. In the United States Constitution, the questions are asked: why are we a country? Why do we exist? Why do we have a government? And what is our government tasked to do? It's 4 things. It's 1, to provide security, domestic safety for its citizens. Secondly, it is to provide for the external defense against predatory neighbors and those further afield who would take what we have. And thirdly, it's a system of material advancement and protection and reward and mutuality of benefit, so that people can have the tangible material things of roofs over their heads and clothes on their back and food in their bodies and the nutrients to make life happen. And fourthly, and by no means least, is a system, a structural system, a governmental system of justice. These 4 things. Look at any transition which we've just begun and we're completing with the Biden administration, and you'll see that the first 4 positions, cabinet positions, in this administration, everyone and everybody watching this who is alive, their lives have seen those 4 or that once filled. What we did in 2003 was shatter all four. Iraq had security, admittedly, unabashedly inhumane, brutal, cruel at times, but the country's people were largely safe in comparison with what happened as a result of any country that's been invaded. Secondly, it had its external defense. No one had invaded Iraq in decades, pushing towards a generation since the end of the Iran-Iraq war. That was shattered to smithereens. Thirdly, the country's territorial integrity was questionable. Fourthly, the system of governmental justice gave way to the rise of ISIS and the resurgence of Al Qaeda, neither of which happened before. And the country's political independence was called into question too, with the influence, the intrusive influence of one of its neighbors and transnational proxy groups as well. So we will be dealing with the consequences of this for a long time. Not to mention 2 million Iraqis were killed as a result. Not to mention that 2 million became domestically displaced. Excuse me, not 2 million Iraqis were killed. 2 million Iraqis became external refugees. Another 2 million became domestically displaced people. That's 4 million people. Nearly, figuratively speaking, to get the point across, 1/6 of Iraq's total population. In American terms, 1/6 of American at that time would have been 50 million Americans whose lives had been shattered, whose dreams had been crashed to smithereens. This is not to mention the number that have been killed, for which I do not have numbers, and maybe others do not either. But we focus on the how questions. How do we deal with these issues? How do we deal with the consequences? How do we deal with other people's legitimate needs, legitimate concerns, legitimate interests, legitimate foreign relations and foreign policy objectives? We have our work cut out for us, but the Iraqi ambassador has at least charted a way for us to see beyond what we read and hear from others about the situation, the reality, and the dynamics of Iraq. We're grateful to you, Mr. Ambassador, and for you, Colonel Dahouk, and for others who put questions through which you've put the question and the ambassador has responded. Thank you both. Thank you all.
So I wanted to leave on a positive note. Dr. Anthony mentioned Iraq's history. Now it's possible for Americans to go and visit that museum. The Council of Ministers just passed a ruling allowing Americans and citizens of another 30 countries to go to Baghdad and ask for a visa and be admitted. And all they have to do is pay the transaction fee, which is, I don't know, $30, $40, something like that, maybe a little more.
Oh, that's great.
So that actually, I like that because it takes a burden off of my team. Having to give visas is a hassle. The other thing that I wanted to mention is really bittersweet. Last week, the last remaining Jewish doctor in Iraq died. His name was Dr. Fadl. I actually had met him. But the thing that I want to attract your attention to is this outpouring of warmth and sorrow and the sense of loss at its passing that was throughout Baghdad. In fact, the hospital where he works has dedicated their largest auditorium to him. and that somebody's working on erecting a statue to him. I say this because I think it is a sign of the importance of memory to Iraqis. We remember how it was in the 30s and the 40s when we were a very multicultural society where, we still recall with pride the fact that the first Iraqi independent government had a Jewish finance minister who was one of the best at the time. He, in fact, convinced oil companies to pay their royalties to Iraq in gold, so that when the crash came a few years later, we were, in a much better situation than all the others. So I think this attachment to memory that Iraqi generations pass down the line, I think is one of the things that will help us maintain our compass and reach our objective of rebuilding this country and recovering some of what we had. But for that, we'll need the help of our allies and friends, amongst them the United States. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
No, thank you for joining us. Thank you for remarks, and we also look forward to continuing working with you and with the country Iraq. I'm hopeful that Iraq will recover soon, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony, also for your remarks and time. Until next time.
Thank you.